In the previous video, Ethan arrived at an event with his young girlfriend, Celeste, but was surprised by the presence of his ex-wife, Vivian, now more beautiful and successful than ever. The impact was even greater when he discovered that his son, Leo, had autism, and that for years he had been absent, thinking that money was enough. Determined to change, Ethan began to rebuild the bond with the boy, and for the first time, Vivian allowed Leo to spend a weekend with him. Meanwhile, Vivian enjoyed her time alone, and now Ethan wonders, did she just want a moment to herself or has she moved on? Ethan entered the apartment and closed the door behind him. The silence enveloped him in a suffocating way. For years he'd come home late, exhausted but satisfied with his life. A drink, a hot shower, and the next day he would follow his usual routine between meetings and women who came in and out of his life without leaving any real mark. But now everything seemed cold, impersonal. He threw his keys on the table and ran a hand over his face. It wasn't just tiredness. It was the feeling that for the first time, his life no longer revolved around contracts, dinners, and unbridled ambition. For the first time, he felt he had something bigger to rebuild. He sat down on the sofa and closed his eyes. And then the memories came like an old movie, projected into his mind without permission. In the beginning, everything with Vivian had seemed perfect. He remembered the first time he saw her, how he felt challenged by her poise, by her intelligence. While other women did everything they could to impress him, Vivian seemed oblivious to his rehearsed charm. She made him laugh, she made him feel seen, and he loved her. But not enough. At the time, he believed that success meant being admired. That a real man was one who commanded respect, who made everyone around him want to be like him. And in the midst of this illusion, he neglected her. Vivian would wait up for him on nights when he said he was working late. She would text him to ask if he was coming back. He, on the other end, would reply with empty phrases. Just a little longer. I'm leaving. It's important for business. But the truth was that he liked the attention. He liked being the man everyone wanted to meet. He liked seeing women look at him with admiration. He liked the feeling of power, and in the process, he pushed Vivian away. First there were the fights. She would say that she missed him, that she wanted more from him. He retorted that she didn't understand how things worked. Then came the silences. The nights when he came home late and she was already asleep. The days when they barely spoke. Until finally the worst part came, the moment when she stopped caring. She remembered one particular evening. Vivian had prepared a special dinner, something simple but lovingly made. He said he would be on time, but he didn't. When he finally entered the house, he found the table still set, but the food already cold. Vivian was sitting on the sofa, staring at the turned-off television. He tried to explain, but she just smiled, an empty smile, and said, "It's okay." And that was the last time she really waited for him. Now sitting on that sofa, Ethan felt the crushing weight of every mistake he had ever made. For years he thought he could just move on, that relationships were disposable. But now, watching Vivian flourish without him, realizing that Leo had lived for years without his presence, he understood what he had really lost. And the worst thing was that it might already be too late. Vivian was different. Not just more confident, but more fulfilled. He could see it in the sparkle in her eyes, in the assured tone of her voice. She didn't need him anymore. And then, the thought he had been trying to avoid finally hit him hard. What if there was another man? Vivian had asked for some time alone, but what if that time was for someone else? Who wouldn't want to be by her side? A beautiful, successful, intelligent, independent woman. He knew that if it weren't for the man who had destroyed his marriage, he would be exactly where anyone else would want to be, by her side. He felt a pang of jealousy, an irrational fear that, while he was struggling to rebuild his relationship with Leo, someone else was already filling the space he had left. But did he have the right to feel that way, after everything he'd done? If Vivian was with someone, he would have to accept it, but not without fighting for her first. He picked up his cell phone, opened the conversation with Vivian and stared at the screen. He wanted to send her a message. He wanted to ask where she'd been at the weekend. He wanted to know if anyone was there. But he couldn't. If he really wanted Vivian back, he had to do it the right way, with patience, with constancy, showing her that he was no longer the man she had to leave behind. With a heavy sigh, Ethan locked the screen of his cell phone and threw it on the table. If he wanted Vivian back, he couldn't just say that, he had to prove it. And for the first time in his life, he was willing to wait. Ethan spent the next few days immersed in a routine that, for the first time, didn't involve endless meetings, fancy dinners, or empty nights with women he would forget the next morning. His focus was just one: Leo. Every afternoon, at exactly 3 o'clock, he was at the school gate waiting for his son. Without fail, no delays. At first, Leo still looked uncertain, as if he was expecting Ethan to disappear again at any moment. But little by little, the look on the boy's face began to change. On Wednesday, as they were leaving school, Leo stopped beside the car and looked at his father. "Are you always coming?" The question took Ethan by surprise. He bent down to meet his son's gaze. "Always," he replied, with more conviction than ever. Leo just nodded, as if he were testing those words, seeing if he could believe them. That night, lying in bed, Ethan realized that something inside him had changed. For the first time, he wanted someone to believe in him, not for what he had, but for what he was capable of offering. And that's where things got complicated, because no matter how hard he tried to rebuild his relationship with Leo, one doubt wouldn't leave him alone. Vivian. She didn't seem like the same woman he'd left behind. And if he was honest with himself, that was the part that terrified him the most. What if she really had moved on? The thought consumed him like a slow poison. He found himself analyzing the smallest details. The moments when she smiled into the phone, the days when she seemed more distracted, the way her posture had changed. And then there was that weekend, the first time she had asked to be left alone. Ethan knew he shouldn't, but he opened Instagram and typed Vivian's name into the search. Her page was discreet, without many personal posts, but he found some recent photos, a glass of wine on an elegant table, an open book next to a cup of coffee, a view of the city lit up at night. Nothing revealing. Nothing that pointed to someone else. But that's what made him even more uneasy. What if she was hiding something? He dropped his cell phone on the bed and closed his eyes, angry with himself. He couldn't act like an insecure man. If Vivian was with someone else, he had no right to question it. But damn it, it was killing him inside. The next day, Ethan decided to do something different. When Leo got into the car, he asked, "Do you mind if I come with you to your therapy today?" Leo blinked a few times, clearly taken aback. "Do you want to go?" "Yes, if you think it's cool." The boy hesitated for a moment. Then he shrugged. "Okay." Ethan felt his chest relax. He knew that, for Leo, this meant more than the boy let on. At the office, Sienna, the therapist, greeted them with a smile, but her expression changed when she saw Ethan. "So you've come," she said, crossing her arms. "I want to understand you better," he replied. "I want to know how I can help." She studied his face for a moment before nodding. "Then sit back and watch. Today, Leo is going to show me what he learned in the last session." Ethan stood to the side, watching as his son solved challenges, talked about number patterns, and sometimes remained silent for long minutes before responding. He began to notice small details, the way Leo avoided eye contact when he was anxious, how he moved his fingers repetitively over his leg when he was trying to organize his thoughts. How had he never noticed this before? When the session was over, Sienna called him in for a chat. "It was important that you came today," she said. "But Leo needs consistency. He needs to know that you're not going away again." Ethan nodded. "I know, and I won't." That night, as he drove home, he found himself thinking about Vivian, how she dealt with everything on her own, how many times she felt like calling him and gave up. He needed to see her. When he parked in front of the building, he hesitated before getting out of the car. She took a deep breath and climbed the stairs to her apartment. He knocked on the door. It opened a few seconds later. "You're here late," she said, frowning. "I wanted to talk to you." Vivian crossed her arms, appraising him. "What about?" Ethan stared at her for a moment. "About how Leo's therapy went today," he said, watching her reaction. Vivian blinked in surprise. "Oh yes, I already talked to Dr. Sienna and she told me everything." "All right then." She was silent for a moment. Then she gave him a small smile, a sincere smile he hadn't seen for a long time. "Thank you for that," she said. Ethan felt something warm up inside him, but before he could say anything, he heard a sound coming from inside the apartment. A male laugh. His chest instantly froze. Vivian noticed the change in his expression and sighed. "Ethan." He took a step back. "Do you have someone?" Vivian was silent for a long moment. Then he answered, "Does it matter?" Ethan's stomach churned. He wanted to shout that it did, that it mattered, that it was destroying him inside. But he couldn't, not now. "I'll see you tomorrow," was all he managed to say before turning his back and walking away. His heart was pounding as he walked down the stairs. The sense of loss was unbearable. What if he had arrived too late? He needed to know the truth, and he was willing to find out, whatever the cost. Ethan entered the house and closed the door tightly, as if to stop the flood of thoughts that tormented him. He threw his keys on the table and sank onto the sofa, running his hands through his hair. The male laughter he had heard in Vivian's house still echoed in his mind, mixed with the question that was eating him up inside. Does she have someone? The idea seemed absurd, or maybe it wasn't. Vivian was beautiful, intelligent, and independent. Why shouldn't she? But that wasn't all. Did this man already know Leo? That was the part that destroyed him. The possibility of another man coming into his son's life, taking up the space he was supposed to fill. What if this guy wanted to be a father figure to Leo? Ethan felt his stomach turn. He never thought that one day he would have to deal with this possibility, but there it was, crushing his chest like an unbearable weight. He picked up his cell phone and opened Vivian's contact. His fingers hovered over the keypad. But what would he say? "Who was at your house yesterday?" No. That would sound pathetic. He blocked the phone and threw himself on the sofa, trying to push the thought away. But that night, sleep was impossible. The next morning, Ethan tried to concentrate on his work, but his mind was far away. In the office, his assistants talked about contracts, investments, and meetings, but nothing seemed important. He needed answers. When he left to pick Leo up from school, he made a decision. He would ask his son, in a casual way, without sounding desperate. As he drove, his mind formulated the right approach. If Leo knew something, would he tell him? On the way home, Ethan sniffed, trying to sound nonchalant. "So, Leo, how was the weekend with your mum?" "It was nice," the boy replied absent-mindedly, looking out of the window. "Did you do anything different?" Leo thought for a moment. "She went out for a while, but I stayed with Aunt Laura." Ethan felt his heart race. "She did." Leo just shrugged and started talking about a new game he'd learned at school. He completely changed the subject. It made Ethan's heart freeze. He turned away. Leo never shied away from simple questions. Had Vivian taught him not to tell certain things? The doubt became unbearable. When they arrived at the building, Ethan got out of the car and went to take Leo to the entrance of the apartment, but something stopped him. There was a men's sandal on the front door. For Ethan's chest tightened, as if something had been ripped out of it. It was big, very big. There was no doubt about it. There was another man there. Ethan felt the world spin. He stood still, just staring at the shoes, as if they were a death sentence. Leo had already run into the apartment. Ethan wanted to see him come in, wanted to say something to Vivian, but he couldn't. His body moved on its own. He turned his back and walked back to his car, feeling completely defeated. Vivian appeared at the door. "What's up, Ethan?" But he was already inside the car, closing the door. She frowned strangely. He always waited to say goodbye to Leo, but this time he left without saying anything. Intrigued, she walked over to the living room window, and then she saw him. Ethan was in the car, his hands gripping the steering wheel, his gaze fixed on some point. His chest was rising and falling rapidly, as if he was suffocating. And then, before she could understand what was happening, she saw him run his hands over his face. He was crying. Vivian felt something stir inside her, but she didn't allow herself to go any deeper. She just turned away from the window and went back inside. She had work to do. The next day, Ethan still felt the weight of that discovery. He could barely concentrate, and to make matters worse, he had an appointment right when he was due to pick Leo up from school and take him to therapy. For a moment, he hesitated. Maybe it would be better to cancel with Leo and focus on work. But then he remembered something Sienna had said. Leo needs consistency, not empty promises. He couldn't go wrong again. He picked up the phone and called his assistant. Reschedule the meeting for another day. Mr. Calloway, this contract is important. I know, but my son is more. And he hung up. At 3 o'clock, Ethan was at the school gate. Leo saw him and smiled slightly before getting into his car. After therapy, Ethan drove him home, but this time he didn't want to go upstairs. He didn't want to see if that man was still there. So when they arrived at the building, he stayed in the car. Vivian, realizing he wasn't coming up, went down to get Leo. She walked to the car, and when Ethan saw her approaching, he felt his heart skip a beat. She looked beautiful. Her loose hair fell over her shoulders, and her confident posture reminded him of the woman he had known years ago. But there was something different about her, something that made his chest tighten. As she helped Leo out of the car, Ethan noticed that Vivian was holding her cell phone in one hand, and between one gesture and the next, she glanced discreetly at the screen. And then something broke inside him, because every time she read a message, a small smile appeared on her lips. A slight smile, almost imperceptible, but Ethan saw it, and that was enough to destroy any hope he still had. He felt his blood run cold. She was talking to someone. Ethan stood motionless, his heart racing, watching Vivian take Leo by the hand and walk back to the building. Her every step felt like a blow against him. The truth was there. She had already moved on. Ethan gripped the steering wheel so hard that his fingers turned white. He needed to know. Who was the man in Vivian's life? And what did he mean to Leo? He couldn't stay in the dark, and he wouldn't. One way or another, he would find out the truth. The weekend was coming, and Ethan was already preparing to pick Leo up. But this time, there was something different in the air. It was another weekend he would spend with his son, but the first after his suspicion that Vivian had someone. He couldn't stop thinking. Did Vivian have a boyfriend? If so, was this man already a part of Leo's life? The thought of another man occupying a space that should be his was consuming him. As he drove to pick up his son from school, Ethan tried to rationalize his feelings. Vivian had the right to move on. He knew that, but knowing and accepting were completely different things. When Leo got into the car, Ethan decided that he didn't want to spend the weekend in that town. He needed some time away from that suffocating environment. "Leo, how about a little trip?" The boy looked at him, curious. "Where to?" "Surprise," Ethan replied, trying to sound cheerful. And so he hit the road to a neighboring town. The destination? A remote hotel surrounded by nature, far from anything that could remind him of Vivian and her paranoia. The hotel was a refuge, surrounded by huge trees, with a crystal-clear lake and a path that led to a hidden waterfall. It was the kind of place Ethan would never have chosen before, but now it made perfect sense. Leo was enchanted from the first moment. His eyes sparkled as he watched the birds, the fish in the lake and the starry sky. Ethan realized something. Being there, with Leo, made him feel something he hadn't felt for years. Peace. The hours passed quickly. They walked along the trail, swam in the lake, and for the first time, Ethan found himself genuinely disconnected from the world he had always valued. No events, no lavish dinners, no business calls. Just him and his son. That evening, Leo took out a notebook and began scribbling numbers, creating mathematical patterns. Ethan watched with a smile. "Is that a challenge for me?" Leo hesitated, then nodded. Ethan picked up a pen and started solving. This time, it wasn't just a game. It was a moment between father and son. Sunday came too quickly. In a few hours they would be going home. In the middle of the afternoon, Ethan's phone vibrated. Vivian. He picked up the phone, took a deep breath, and answered. "Hi. Hi, how was your weekend?" "Great. Leo loved it," Ethan replied. There was silence on the other end of the line. Then she said something that made his stomach turn. "I'm near your house with some people." "Can I stop by and pick up Leo?" Ethan was speechless for a moment. People, that was it. She was with him. She was coming with her boyfriend. Ethan tried to keep his tone neutral. "Of course. Let me know when you're coming." "Okay. I'll call you in a bit." The call ended, but the knot in Ethan's chest only grew. This was it. He would finally have to face the truth. Vivian would move on, with another man, and all he could do was accept it. Hours later, when they finally arrived back in the city, Ethan's cell phone vibrated again. "Vivian." "We're at the door." Ethan felt his body freeze. This was it. He stood up slowly, feeling the weight of that walk to the door. Before leaving, he glanced at the window. And then he saw it. In the car parked in front, there was a man at the wheel. Vivian was in the back seat. Ethan's heart stopped. The blood drained from his face. It was real. She was with someone else. And now he would have to face his greatest fear. Time seemed to stop. Ethan stood there staring at the car. His heart was pounding so hard that he could hardly breathe. Vivian was sitting in the back seat, and a man was behind the wheel. His chest tightened. He could taste the bitterness of defeat before he had even confirmed what he feared. He was about to lose Vivian. Swallowing dryly, he took a few steps towards the vehicle, forcing himself to stand firm, as if it didn't affect him. But it did. Every fiber of his being burned with jealousy, regret, and frustration. Before he could process anything, Leo opened the car door and jumped towards his mother. "Mom, the weekend was amazing." Vivian smiled when she saw her son so excited. She grabbed him to hug him. "Was it? Tell me all about it." Ethan watched the scene, his chest still tight, but was soon pulled out of his thoughts when he heard the driver's door opening. A deep, familiar voice rang out. "Great Ethan, miss you, my dear." Ethan blinked, confused. He knew that voice. When his eyes finally focused on the man in front of him, everything made sense. It was Charles, his ex-brother-in-law, Vivian's older brother. The heaviness in his chest disappeared almost instantly. It wasn't a boyfriend, it was Charles, the sandal on the door, the laughter inside the apartment, the man Vivian was spending time with. It was just her brother. Ethan had to stop himself from laughing with relief. He had spent days tormented by an idea that never existed. "Charles, my God, what a long time," Ethan said, now really surprised and happy. The two hugged each other tightly, a genuine energy in the encounter. Charles had always been a nice guy. They used to get on very well before the divorce. Charles tapped Ethan on the shoulder. "Vivian told me you've been spending more time with Leo. Man, I don't even know what to say. That's incredible." Ethan looked at Vivian, who kept a wary eye on him, but didn't interfere in the conversation. "I'm trying to make up for lost time," Ethan admitted bluntly. Charles nodded. "Well, the important thing is to be here now." Leo looked excitedly at the two of them. "Uncle Charles came to visit. He's living with Mom for a few days." Vivian smiled slightly. "He's spending some time with me. He had some problems with his marriage and needed a place to think." Ethan absorbed the information. So that was it. All those days of paranoia, the assumptions, the jealousy, all based on a misunderstanding. He almost sighed with relief. Almost. Because despite everything, he knew that it didn't change the fact that Vivian could move on at any moment. And if that happened, he needed to be ready to deal with it. But right now he just wanted to enjoy the feeling of relief. When Charles and Vivian said they needed to go, Ethan had an idea. "Why don't you guys come over for dinner tomorrow?" he suggested, trying to sound casual. Vivian raised an eyebrow in surprise. Charles smiled. "That would be great." "What do you think, Viv?" Vivian hesitated for a moment. She looked at Leo, who was watching her expectantly, and sighed. "All right, we can go." Leo's face lit up. "Are you having dinner together? All of us?" Ethan smiled. "Yes. Champ. All of us." Leo jumped for joy, clearly excited by the idea. Vivian just nodded. "See you tomorrow, then." Ethan stood there watching the car drive away, and for the first time in a long time he felt hope. Now that he knew the truth, he was sure he could win his family back. He had already proved that he loved Leo. Now he had to prove to Vivian that he deserved a second chance too, and this time he wouldn't make the same mistakes. The morning of the next day dawned with a clear sky and bright sunshine, but Ethan felt as if a storm was about to rage inside him. He got up early, unable to sleep properly. Dinner that night wasn't just a meal, it was a test. He had already won Leo over. His son was now waiting for him outside school, texting him about the day and even asking to spend more time with him. But Vivian was still a mystery. There were moments when he felt that she was softening, that perhaps there was still something there between them. But then came her cautious gaze, the invisible barriers that kept him at a safe distance. He couldn't rush her, but he could prove that he was willing to fight. With that in mind, he spent the day organizing every detail of the dinner. He asked his housekeeper to prepare an impeccable menu, with Vivian and Leo's favorite dishes. He chose the best wine, thought about the lighting and the light soundtrack in the background. No exaggeration. He wanted the evening to be natural, cozy. He wanted Vivian to feel at home again. When he picked Leo up from school, he noticed that the boy was restless in the back seat. "Looking forward to today?" Ethan asked. Leo shook his head in the affirmative. "It's going to be nice. I've never seen Mom and you together like this. Just us. Like a family." Those words hit Ethan hard in the chest. A family. That's what he wanted. "It's going to be a special night," Ethan promised, lightly squeezing his son's shoulder. They made their way to the mansion, where they spent the afternoon together. Ethan showed Leo every detail he had prepared for dinner, and the boy seemed overjoyed. When the clock struck 7:30, the doorbell rang. Ethan took a deep breath before opening the door. And then there she was, Vivian, dazzling. She wore a blue dress that highlighted her golden skin. Her loose hair fell in soft waves, and her delicate perfume hit Ethan before he could even say anything. He remained silent, just watching her. Charles laughed beside her, crossing his arms. "Are you going to let her in, or are you going to keep staring like that, brother?" Ethan blinked, feeling his face heat up. Vivian laughed lightly. "Good night, Ethan." "Good night. You look amazing." Vivian thanked him but looked away quickly, not wanting to give him the victory of seeing how much his words affected her. They went inside, and the evening began. Dinner was light and relaxed. Charles had a talent for turning any conversation into something funny. Leo laughed at his uncle's jokes, and Vivian seemed relaxed. Ethan enjoyed every second. For a moment, they really did feel like a family again. But he wanted more. After dinner, Leo called Charles to show him the new bedroom. And then Ethan and Vivian were alone. The silence between them was heavy. Vivian was the first to speak. "I have to admit, Ethan, I'm surprised. You really do look different." He held her gaze. "Because I am different, Vivian." She sighed, crossing her arms. "What do you think has changed?" Ethan took a deep breath. "I've realized what I've lost." He looked directly at her. "And I realized that I can still get it back, if you let me." Vivian opened her mouth to reply, but he held up his hand, asking her to wait. "I'm not pressuring you. You can have as much time as you need. I just want you to know that I'm here, that I'm going to stay here. No matter how long it takes, I'm going to fight for us." Vivian felt her heart race. She wanted to resist, she wanted to protect herself. But Ethan was being sincere. She'd never seen him like this before. Before she could reply, Leo and Charles came back into the room, laughing about something. Vivian pulled away slightly. Ethan understood. The conversation wasn't over. But it wasn't time to end it yet. Before they left, Vivian wanted to see Leo's room. When she entered, she was surprised. There were shelves organized with Leo's favorite books and games, a mural with drawings and mathematical challenges. The space had been designed for her son. "It was all Leo's idea," Ethan explained proudly. "He said he wanted his own corner in here." Leo snuggled into bed, picking up one of the challenge books. Vivian ran her hand over the mural, absorbing every detail. She looked at Ethan. "You really did it." Ethan nodded. "I want him to know that he'll always have a home with me. That I'm here." She didn't answer. She just nodded, feeling something grow inside her. In parting, Ethan walked to the car with them. When Leo and Charles got in, Vivian turned to Ethan to say goodbye. It was a natural gesture, but then Ethan did something that took her by surprise. He pulled her into a hug. Vivian froze. For an instant, she felt like time was going backwards. The smell of him, the warmth of his body, the way he wrapped his arms around her. And worse, she liked it. Her heart leapt. She closed her eyes, absorbing the moment, but then reason spoke louder. She pulled away. Ethan stared at her intensely. "Good night, Vivian." "Good night, Ethan." She got into the car, trying to ignore the whirlwind inside her. At home, Charles noticed that Vivian was different. "Okay, go ahead. What's going on in your head?" Vivian hesitated. "I still love Ethan." The confession came out without her realizing it. Charles smiled slightly. "You always have, Vivian." She ran a hand over her face. "But what if he changes again? What if I give it a chance and end up getting hurt?" Charles picked up a glass of water and leaned against the counter. "Look, no one can guarantee the future, but you know what I've learned. You only regret what you don't try." Vivian bit her lip. "I know he made a mistake, but I also know that no one loves this family like he does." Charles nodded. "The woman builds the home, Vivian. If you still have feelings, fight for them. Don't let fear define your story," Vivian sighed. "I just wish someone would say that to my wife too," Charles joked, trying to lighten the load of the conversation. Vivian smiled, but inside she was still confused. When she entered the bedroom, she closed the door and sat down on the bed. Everything inside her was in chaos. Looking at her cell phone, she saw a message from Ethan. "Good night, Vivian. Sleep well." Her heart leapt. She stared at the screen for long seconds, hesitating. Then she typed a single reply. "Good night, Ethan." When she turned off the light, she realized that for the first time in a long time, her heart wasn't set. Should she move on, or give love another chance? The next day, the sun was streaming through the curtains of Vivian's apartment, softly illuminating the room. She was in the kitchen making coffee when Leo came running in, excited. "Mom, Dad said there's a surprise for us today." Vivian turned to him, frowning. "Surprise?" Leo nodded vigorously. "Yes, and Uncle Charles has to go too." Across the table, Charles, who had just finished his coffee, raised an eyebrow, curious. "Well, if it's free food, I'm in." Vivian laughed, but deep down, a chill formed in her stomach. What was Ethan planning? Another dinner again? Across town at Ethan's mansion, he was carefully organizing every detail. He wanted everything to be perfect again, because that night meant so much. He was going to have a new dinner, and he wanted to show Vivian that he was really changing, that he was willing to fight for his family, but without rushing, without demanding. He was also thinking about Charles, who was still dealing with his marriage crisis. Perhaps with a little help, he could give him a chance to fix his own story too. When Vivian, Leo and Charles arrived, the atmosphere was welcoming. The table was elegantly set, and the soft lights set an intimate tone. Vivian looked around in surprise. The smell of home-cooked food wafted through the air, but what really caught her eye was a large mural in the corner of the room. Photos of special moments were there. Leo as a baby in her arms, Ethan and Vivian smiling on an old trip, Charles holding Leo in his early years, and right in the center a handwritten phrase, "Family is where we can always start again." Vivian felt her heart squeeze. Charles looked at Ethan, then at the mural and gave a surprised smile. "You did that?" Ethan nodded, looking directly at Vivian. "I want us to build something new, but at the right time." She looked away, trying to process it. Why was he being like this now? So different from the man she knew. Leo pulled Charles by the arm, anxious. "Uncle, come and see what I have to show you." The two of them went upstairs, laughing, and suddenly Vivian and Ethan were alone in the living room. She crossed her arms, trying to ignore the way her heart beat faster when he looked at her like that. "You've always been good at grand gestures, Ethan. But can you keep it up when there's no audience?" He moved closer, his voice low and sincere. "I know it took me a while to understand what really matters, but now I know, and I'm willing to prove it, one day at a time." Vivian took a deep breath. "What if I can't trust you not to change again?" Ethan gently held her hands. "I'll give you as much time as you need. But I need you to know I've never wanted anything as much in my life as I want to fix it. Her eyes sparkled for a moment, as if a part of her was tempted to believe. But before she could reply, Leo's voice echoed from upstairs. "Mum, Daddy has a surprise for Uncle Charles." She frowned, confused, and exchanged a curious glance with Ethan before going upstairs with him to see what was going on. In Leo's room, Charles was sitting on the bed, watching his nephew enthusiastically explain his inventions. Ethan entered the room and crossed his arms, looking at his brother-in-law. "Charles, there's someone who wants to talk to you." The man frowned, not understanding. Ethan took out his cell phone and made a video call. A blonde woman with light eyes and a hesitant smile appeared on the screen. Emily, Charles's wife. His face changed instantly. "Emily. Yes, I wanted to talk to you." Silence filled the room. Charles was paralyzed, as if he didn't know if it was real. Ethan looked at Vivian and took her hand. "Let's give them a moment." Vivian followed him out of the room, still trying to absorb what was happening. In the living room, she stared at him. "You did this for my brother?" Ethan smiled. "He just needed a push, just like I did." She remained silent, studying him. "I wish I could believe that people change so easily." Ethan moved a little closer. "I didn't change easily, Vivian. I just realized that I was losing everything that really mattered." The air seemed to thicken between them. Ethan touched her face gently. "I'm not going to ask you to decide anything now. But if there's still something between us, I hope that one day you'll tell me." Vivian closed her eyes for a moment. She felt it. She knew. There was love there. There always had been. The past still hurt, but the present showed that perhaps love would always find a way. A short while later, Charles came downstairs with a new smile on his face. "Well, looks like I'll be catching a flight soon." Vivian smiled. Ethan helped fix what looked lost. Charles looked at his ex-brother-in-law, then at his sister. "Maybe he can fix more than that." Vivian looked away for a moment, but then let out a soft laugh and shook her head. Before she could think twice, she stepped forward and hugged Ethan. He stood still for a second, surprised, but then wrapped his arms around her tightly, feeling the warmth of her body against his. It was like coming home after years of being lost. Leo, who was watching everything from the top of the stairs, opened his eyes wide and ran towards his parents, hugging them at the same time, squeezing himself between them. "I knew it," he said excitedly, looking from one to the other. "I knew we were a family." Ethan and Vivian exchanged an emotional look. She touched his face gently, and he held her hand, feeling as if he were holding something too precious to lose again. Without hesitation, Ethan leaned in and kissed her. It was a quiet kiss, full of silent promises, a kiss that said everything that words could never express. Vivian didn't pull back. On the contrary, she surrendered to the moment, because there in his arms, with Leo between them, she realized something she had avoided for a long time. There was still love. And this time, they were ready to make it work. The end. If you like this story, leave a rating from 0 to 10 in the comments. Your feedback is very important for us to keep bringing you exciting stories. Don't forget to leave your like and subscribe to the channel for more content like this. Now click on the video that appears on the screen and continue watching another incredible story.